On a frozen morning in Ridgehaven, a reclusive veteran named Luke Harrison thought he'd left the world behind, until he heard two German shepherd puppies crying beneath the snow moments before a drunken man tried to crush them under his boot. Luke's rescue should have ended the nightmare, but fate had sharper claws. Within days, his remote cabin mysteriously erupted in flames, trapping him, an elderly woman, and the helpless pups inside. And the person who stepped through the fire to save them was the same man who tried to kill them. What could drive a monster to become a savior? And what secret was buried deep enough to rewrite all their lives? If this story touches you, please help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers. Your click really means more than you think. God bless you for keeping hope alive. Morning settled over Ridgehaven like a pale shroud, the frozen air holding its silence with the patience of an old god watching from the cliffs. The snow had fallen all night, blanketing the harbor, the rooftops, and the winding path along the sea in a white that felt both pure and merciless. Luke Harrison walked this path with habitual caution, his boots crunching over ice, while the wind tugged at the edges of his worn brown leather coat. At 45, he carried his years not in the lines on his face, but in the weight behind his gray eyes, eyes carved deep by memories that refused to be buried. He stood 6 feet tall, lean with a strength that once had been solid, but now seemed hollowed, as though something inside him had burned away over time. His jaw was sharp beneath a stubborn scatter of stubble, and his dark brown hair, grown longer than he liked, brushed his collar streaked with silver at the temples, like frost that had settled there permanently. Ridgehaven had seen him like this for 3 years, moving through town wrapped in his flannel shirt of red and navy jeans, faded to gray boots scuffed by salt and weather, and a gray wool scarf wound loosely about his neck. The locals had learned he was a man of few words, a man who nodded hello when necessary, but rarely stayed long enough for the conversation that might expose old wounds. His only companion on these walks was Maxwell, his aging German shepherd, a noble dog with a sturdy frame and a coat of black and tan, now dusted at the muzzle with gray. Maxwell was 11 slow in his joints, but proud in spirit, the kind of animal whose loyalty felt carved into his bones. His dark amber eyes scanned the world with a calm vigilance, sensing pain in others long before they sensed it in themselves. On that cold morning, Luke hoped for another quiet walk, one where the sea's distant roar might drown out the echoes in his mind. But fate had a different script waiting. It began with a sound, thin trembling, almost too delicate to belong to this harsh winter world. A cry. Luke stopped mid-step. Maxwell froze beside him, ears lifting sharply. For Luke, the sound pierced deeper. It reminded him of something he once heard on a dust-choked battlefield years ago, the helpless whimper of a life fading too quickly. His pulse tightened. He followed the cry each step, pulling him toward a narrow alley behind Miller's Tavern, a squat wooden building whose dim windows usually glowed with the bitterness of men who couldn't outrun their ghosts. As Luke rounded the corner, the scene struck him like a blow. 2 German shepherd puppies, no more than 7 weeks old, lay shivering in the snow, their fur stiff with frost, tiny bodies curled together in instinctive desperation. One whimpered weakly, the other barely moved at all. Hovering over them was Hank Miller, the tavern owner. Hank was in his early 50s, a burly man with a round face blotched red from alcohol and cracked winter skin. His greasy brown beard framed a mouth set perpetually in a sneer, and his eyes, bleary, bloodshot, wounded by his own demons, glimmered with something uglier than rage. Hank lifted his boot again, swaying slightly as if the cold itself rejected him. Useless mutts, he slurred. Should have frozen last night. Luke didn't think. His body moved before reason had time to catch up. Maxwell lunged first, a deep warning growl rolling from his chest like thunder barely contained. Hank stumbled backward, startled. "What the hell? Who's there?" Luke stepped into view, shoulders squared, though his breath trembled in the brittle air. "Put your foot down," he said, voice low, controlled, yet lined with a steel that even he didn't know he still possessed. Hank squinted, then barked a hoarse laugh. "Oh, it's you, Luke Harrison, the great survivor?" He spat in the snow. "Look at you now, a broken hero hiding on a cliff pretending you can save something." The words sliced into Luke because they were frighteningly close to the truth. He had failed before. Failed someone who had trusted him. The memory pressed against his chest like a fist. But this moment these puppies were not going to carry that same ending. Luke knelt swiftly, scooping the fragile bodies into his arms. One pup lifted its head just slightly, its eyes glazed with confusion. The other lay limp breath, shallow. He could feel its tiny ribs flutter beneath his fingers. "You think you're saving them?" Hank jeered, stepping forward, though uncertainty wavered in his stance. "You can't even save yourself." Maxwell moved like a shadow, placing his body between Hank and Luke. His muscles coiled, his growl colder than the wind. The message was clear: one more step would be one too many. Luke rose, holding the puppies tightly against his chest. "Go home, Hank," he murmured, "before this gets worse." The snow swirled in the alley as Hank pointed a shaking finger at him. "You'll regret this, Harrison, mark my words. You'll regret the day you crossed me." His voice cracked, not with anger alone, but with something rawer, hurt fear, maybe grief twisted into poison. Luke didn't respond. He turned away, pushing out of the alley, Maxwell close at his heel. The cold bit at his face as he adjusted his grip on the pups, holding them close to share what little warmth he had left. Behind him, Hank's shouting dissolved into the mournful wind. Maxwell let out a long, uneasy howl, a sound Luke had heard only when storms or danger approached. And as Luke walked toward the cliffs, the sky darkened slightly, as though the world itself sensed that something unseen had begun to shift. The snow fell harder. The wind sharpened. And the fate awaiting Luke Harrison stepped quietly out of the shadows, unseen but inevitable. Snow drifted across the cliffs in restless spirals, as if the wind itself could not decide whether to soothe the world or cut through it. Luke Harrison pushed the cabin door open with his shoulder, his breath sharp clouds in the icy air as he carried the two fragile puppies against his chest. Maxwell trotted beside him, his aging frame tense, but determined, his breath steady in the cold. Inside the cabin felt dimmer than usual. The old wooden floor creaked under Luke's boots, and his shadow, stretched by the flickering light of the small stove, looked far taller and more haunted than the man himself. His dark brown hair, soaked through by snow, clung to the silvered streaks at his temples. Water dripped from the ends, running down to his jaw, where bristled stubble caught the drops like thorns holding dew. His gray eyes, usually dulled by quiet avoidance, were sharpened now by urgency, and something deeper fear he refused to acknowledge. He knelt near the stove, lowering the two puppies onto a folded wool blanket. "Easy now," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to them or to himself. The larger pup, the sturdier one, let out a faint whine. Luke touched its warm belly, relieved to feel resistance. "Rufus," he said softly, choosing the name instinctively, as if it had been waiting in the air. The smaller pup lay still, barely breathing, its tiny chest rising only with the trembling uncertainty of a dying ember. Its fur was lighter, softer, its paws almost weightless in Luke's hands. "And you," he whispered, brushing a delicate ear. "You'll be Luna." As he spoke, the name Luna exhaled a breath so thin Luke wasn't sure he hadn't imagined it. He wrapped them both in his old flannel shirt, the red and navy pattern swallowing their tiny forms. Maxwell settled beside him, lowering his head close to the puppies, his warm breath drifting over them like a protective veil. Luke began rubbing Luna's chest with slow, rhythmic strokes. His calloused hands that had once carried wounded soldiers from blackened battlefields now trembled as they pressed over a heart no bigger than a thumb. "Stay with me," he whispered, leaning close. "Not again. Not this time." The crackling fire licked shadows across his face, revealing the tension that lived permanently in his jaw, the stiffness in his shoulders of a man bracing for loss. He had once believed he could outwalk memory, letting the sea wind erode it piece by piece. But some things followed you, no matter how far you ran. As he worked, the cabin door swung open, and a gust of cold swept in, along with the scent of cinnamon and warm bread. Evelyn Hart stepped inside snowflakes clinging to her knitted hat. At 58, she had the kind of presence that softened any room she entered. She was petite but sturdy, with warm olive skin, thick curly gray hair tucked under her hat, and gentle lines at the corners of her hazel eyes, lines carved not by age but by years of kindness given freely. She carried a thermos gripped tight between her gloved hands. "I saw you rushing home," she said, concern deepening her voice. "Thought you might need this." Luke looked up briefly, his expression a quiet mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "Thanks," he said, voice firmer than he meant it to be. Evelyn stepped closer, her boots thudding softly on the wood. When she saw the puppies, she gasped. "Oh, Luke." She knelt beside him, eyes warming at the sight of Rufus, and softening with a deeper worry as they rested on Luna. Poor little things. Luke resumed rubbing Luna's chest, his breath shallow. One of them's barely hanging on. Evelyn placed a hand on his arm, a gentle, steady touch. "Luke, Ridgehaven isn't where God brought you to disappear," she said quietly. "It's where he brought you to heal." The words struck him like an echo from a life he no longer believed belonged to him. His throat tightened. He wanted to dismiss her, to retreat into the silence he had crafted so carefully, but Luna's body twitched suddenly, and all his defenses fell away. For 3 terrifying seconds, Luna's chest stopped moving. Luke's hands froze. His own heart stuttered. Maxwell whined low, nudging Luke urgently. Come on, Luna," Luke pleaded, his voice cracking like ice under weight. He pressed 2 fingers to her chest again, rubbing harder this time, desperate eyes burning with a grief he had sworn never to feel again. "Don't leave." Not like he couldn't finish the sentence. Luna's tiny paw jerked. Then her chest lifted, weak but unmistakably alive. Luke exhaled so sharply he nearly doubled over his shoulders, trembling with relief. Evelyn smiled through tears. "See, even the smallest spark can fight." Luke didn't trust his voice enough to answer. He simply held Luna closer, feeling the faint warmth returning to her fragile body. Outside, the storm howled fiercely, snow whipping against the windows like restless spirits. As night settled, the cabin glowed dimly with firelight, the air inside thick with heat and hope. Luke worked over the puppies while Evelyn prepared tea, her presence the quiet anchor that kept him from sinking into old shadows. Hours passed. The wind did not calm, and neither did the unseen eyes watching from the tree line. Far beyond the glow of the cabin window, Hank Miller stood motionless, his heavy coat dusted with snow, his breath rising in pale clouds. His face, lit faintly by the cabin's firelight, was a strange mixture of anger, confusion, and something darker, something calculating. His gaze rested on Luke's silhouette inside the cabin. His hand clenched and unclenched at his side. He whispered something under his breath, but the wind swallowed it whole. Then he stepped back into the woods, leaving only his fading footprints behind. Inside, Luke lifted Luna once more, unaware of the eyes that had measured him from the dark. He focused only on the tiny heartbeat beneath his fingers, the fragile life he had chosen to save. For now, that was all that mattered. But outside in the storm-laced darkness, tomorrow's danger had already begun to take shape. The morning crept in beneath a veil of pale fog, soft and heavy, as if the sky itself wished to hide whatever truths the day might reveal. Luke Harrison stepped into the crisp air, with Rufus tucked inside his coat and Luna sleeping weakly against his chest. Maxwell walked beside him, his aging joints stiff from the night's cold, yet his eyes, deep amber and unwavering, held a watchfulness that felt almost human. Luke's breath frosted before him, but inside his chest a different kind of chill lingered. He had spent most of the night listening to Luna's fragile breathing, fearing every shallow inhale might be her last. He had closed his eyes only once, and in that brief moment, the memory of another life, another loss had clawed its way forward, a soldier's cry, a failed rescue, the sound of a dying heart he could not bring back. Now, as he walked toward Ridgehaven Veterinary Clinic, he forced the memory down where it belonged, beneath layers of grief he no longer dared to touch. The clinic stood near the Harbor Road, a modest white building with blue trim and a small wooden sign carved with an outline of a dog and cat. Warm yellow light glowed through its frosted windows. Inside, Dr. Lydia Moore prepared the exam room. At 45, Lydia possessed a calm that settled the nerves of both animals and people. Her strawberry blonde hair, streaked gently with early silver, was tied in a loose braid that draped over her shoulder. Freckles dusted her fair skin, and her hazel eyes, sharp, attentive, compassionate, held the steady focus of someone who had learned to rebuild her life after it had been shattered once. She moved with quiet purpose, her slender frame wrapped in a forest green cardigan and dark slacks, her demeanor carrying the warmth of someone who loved healing more than anything else. She looked up as Luke entered. "Morning," she said softly, her voice warm, but edged with professional alertness as her gaze dropped to the small bundle in Luke's arms. "Let me see the pups." Luke nodded and carefully lowered Rufus and Luna onto the stainless steel table. Rufus tried to stand, his little legs wobbling before he settled back down with a faint whine. Luna barely moved. Lydia's brows tightened. She put on gloves and touched Luna gently, fingers tracing the pup's ribs, the pulse at her throat, the fragility of her breath. "They're so young," she murmured. "Too young to have survived a night out there." Luke swallowed, his voice low. "Someone left them in the snow." Lydia studied him for a moment as if she could see the part of him that had fought to keep them alive. "Then someone wanted them to die," she said quietly. She turned to Rufus, inspecting his paws and belly, checking for burns or frostbite. Her movements were slow, methodical. Then she paused, her eyes sharpened. "Luke, these pups weren't strays." He stiffened. "What do you mean?" Lydia lifted Luna's paw and turned it slightly. "See the faint ink? It's smudged, but it looks like a breeder's tag. And—" She hesitated before gently pulling back Luna's fur along her side. A small scar, fresh but healing, stretched thin beneath the soft fur. Rufus had the same marking. Lydia exhaled. "Luke, I've seen this scar before. These puppies belonged to Tyler Miller, Hank Miller's son." Luke felt the ground tilt beneath him. "Tyler, but he died last month," Lydia finished softly. "The fire at the Miller farm. They never found the animals." Luke stared at Luna, shock rippling through him like a cold wave. "So Hank?" "Hank is drowning in guilt," Lydia said, her voice heavy with something like sorrow. "Everyone in town knows he blames himself for what happened. His drinking is anger. They're not just habits, they're shields. Luke's jaw tightened. Shields don't excuse cruelty. No, Lydia agreed, her hazel eyes firm. But they explain it. For a moment the room felt smaller, the fog outside pressing against the windows as if to listen. Luke looked down at Luna. She was barely more than a whisper of life, yet she had survived a fire, abandonment, and last night's bitter cold. He touched her gently. I won't let him hurt them again. Lydia's voice softened. I'll prepare fluids for Luna. She needs hydration, warmth, and time. Both of them do, but they're fighters. I can tell. Luke nodded, reassured, but not calm. He waited as Lydia prepared Luna's injection and offered instructions for their care. His mind, however, kept circling the one image he didn't want to consider: Hank Miller, standing over these tiny creatures with violence in his eyes. When the pups were stable enough to travel, Luke wrapped them carefully in his flannel and left the clinic. Lydia watched him go, worry etching deep lines in her face. She knew the world carried storms that had nothing to do with weather, and Ridgehaven was about to face one. Luke walked back to the cabin, unaware that danger had already stepped ahead of him. As he pushed open the cabin door, he didn't notice the faint metallic scent drifting through the air. He didn't see the subtle shift in the wooden panels near the heater. He only felt the exhaustion settling into his bones as he laid Rufus and Luna near the fire, Maxwell curling protectively around them. He moved through his small kitchen heating water, replaying Lydia's words over and over in his mind. Tyler Miller, a fire, guilt, rage, and Hank standing outside his cabin last night, breath fogging the glass. Luke rubbed his brow with the back of his hand. The pieces didn't fit yet, but something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Night fell swiftly, swallowing the cliffs in a cloak of black. The wind began to rise, rattling the shutters as Luke adjusted the heater's dials. He didn't see the spark. He didn't hear the faint hiss inside the wall. But Maxwell did. The old shepherd lifted his head, ears pricking forward, a low growl vibrating through his chest. Luke turned to him. "What is it, boy?" The answer came in a roar of flame. The cabin exploded into light. The heater burst, sending fire licking across the floorboards, racing up the walls with the hunger of a starved beast. Smoke poured through the room, thick and choking. Luke stumbled, grabbing the puppies and calling for Evelyn, who had stayed to help prepare the pups' blankets. She rushed from the back room, eyes wide in terror, her gray curls illuminated by the orange flames that climbed the walls like living creatures. The door wouldn't budge. The latch was jammed. Smoke clawed at Luke's lungs. Maxwell barked wildly, circling them, urging them toward the window, but the fire was too fast, too fierce. Luke coughed hard, clutching Luna and Rufus to his chest. His vision blurred. Heat surged, the world tilted, and through the thick gray smoke, just as consciousness started to slip away, a dark, broad figure burst into the flames. Hank Miller. Night clung to the burning cabin like a living creature, the flames clawing at the darkness with furious orange fingers, while the wind roared across the Ridgehaven cliffs. Luke Harrison felt the heat blistering against his skin as he stumbled forward, lungs seized by smoke vision spinning with black spots that flickered in and out like dying stars. The firelight glinted off the soot smeared across his cheekbones, deepening the hollow angles of his face and casting his gray eyes into trembling shards of silver. Maxwell barked wildly beside him, the old German shepherd fighting through the suffocating haze, moving between Luke, Evelyn, Rufus, and Luna, as though he could shield them all through sheer will. Evelyn Hart's terrified cries cut through the storm of crackling flames. At 58, her sturdy frame usually held the calm warmth of a baker who had weathered life's sweetest and bitterest seasons, but now her hazel eyes were wide with panic, her breath ragged as she tried to shield the weak Luna against her chest. Her knitted hat was half burned along one edge, and stray curls of gray hair clung damply to her forehead. Luke, the door she choked, pointing. But Luke had already thrown himself against it twice, feeling the swollen wood resist, as though the fire itself were pushing back. His muscles strained, throat burning, every breath scraping against him like broken glass. The heater explosion had turned the cabin into a death trap. Heat swallowed the room. Smoke curled in thick, writhing waves, coiling around them like serpents. Rufus whimpered at Evelyn's feet. Luna's breaths were faint, too faint. Luke's heart hammered with a desperation he had not felt since the battlefield, a desperate pleading fury against fate itself. "Come on," he rasped, pushing at the door again, even though the handle scorched his palm. "Not like this. Not again." Maxwell barked a warning, the kind of bark that came from instinct deeper than fear. Something shifted in the smoke. A shadow moved. A shape broad, stumbling familiar burst into view through a smashed window, as if the fire had spit him out. Hank Miller. His heavy coat scorched along one sleeve, beard singed face, streaked with soot, eyes wide with adrenaline and something painfully human, raw remorse. "Don't give up, Luke!" he shouted, voice cracking above the roar of the flames. "Hand me the pups!" Luke froze for half a heartbeat. Hank, this man who only hours ago reeked of whiskey and hatred, was climbing into a burning building, not to harm, to save. Luke thrust Rufus toward him first. Hank grabbed the pup with surprising steadiness and tucked him inside his jacket. "Evelyn, come on!" Hank bellowed. He reached through the smoke and grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her toward the window. Evelyn, trembling, handed Luna to him, her eyes shining with fear and hope. Hank held Luna close to his chest, shielding her tiny body from the flames with his own. Maxwell Luke coughed. The old dog responded instantly, sprinting toward the window, leaping out despite the fire biting at his tail. Hank grabbed Evelyn under the arms and hauled her upward. She stumbled through the window frame, landing hard in the snow outside, coughing violently but alive. Luke pushed himself toward the opening heat, roaring behind him as part of the ceiling groaned ominously. Hank extended a hand, voice breaking. "Move, Luke, now." Luke swung one leg up, clutching the frame. As he pulled himself through, fire exploded behind him like the cabin's dying scream. No sooner had his boots hit the snow than the weight of the roof collapsed inward with a deafening crash. A plume of embers shot into the sky, swirling like furious fireflies before vanishing into the wind. Luke collapsed to his knees, in the snow, gasping. Evelyn crouched beside him, clutching Rufus and Luna protectively. Maxwell pressed against Luke's side, panting but unhurt eyes fixed on Hank. Hank stood a few feet away, shoulders heaving, his tall frame shaking violently. Whether from cold fear or long-buried grief, none could tell. His eyes glistened behind the soot. Luke struggled to speak, chest tight, voice raw. Why did you come back?" Hank looked at him, lips trembling beneath his charred beard. For a moment the world fell silent, except for the hissing of cooling embers. Then Hank's voice cracked open, fragile as an old wound. "Because I already let my boy die." His throat worked. His jaw trembled. Tears cut streaks through the soot on his cheeks. "I couldn't let anyone else die because of me. Not again. Not tonight." Luke stared. The honest, broken ache in Hank's expression was something he had never seen before. Hank wiped his face with a shaking hand, breath hitching. "Tyler. He was all I had left. And when that fire took him, his voice collapsed. I just stopped being a man worth saving." The flames behind them snapped sharply, illuminating his face, a face carved not just by anger, but devastation. Luke felt something shift inside him, a quiet unwinding of judgment he didn't know he had held so tightly. "You saved us," he murmured. Hank looked down at his burned coat, where Luna whimpered faintly. He gave a humorless laugh that was half sob. Maybe I'm finally trying to make up for something I can't undo. Snow fell softly around them, each flake a small, weightless truth drifting towards the ground. The next morning, Ridgehaven gathered in its small courthouse, a stone building older than most memories. Hank Miller stood before the judge, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow with remorse. The townspeople whispered among themselves. They knew his past. They had seen his cruelty, his drunken rage. But they had also heard what he had done last night. Luke Harrison stepped forward first. Then Evelyn Hart. Then Dr. Lydia Moore. One by one, the three people Hank had hurt in different ways stood up not to condemn, but to speak on his behalf. The judge, a gray-haired man with a stern jaw but gentle eyes, listened quietly. After a long moment, he said, "Hank Miller, your actions have caused harm, fear, and deep wounds. But last night you saved 3 lives. Justice must hold you accountable. Mercy must acknowledge who you are trying to become." He paused. "You are hereby sentenced to 12 months of community labor at the Ridgehaven Animal Rescue Center under the supervision of Luke Harrison." The room fell into a hush, a silence full not of judgment, but of something softer. Hope, maybe. Or forgiveness, learning to stand again. Luke exhaled slowly. Hank bowed his head. And for the first time in years, he looked like a man who understood the cost of grace and the gift of being seen as redeemable. Morning light drifted softly over Ridgehaven, a gentle gold brushing across the cliffs, where winter once took so much and left so little. A thin mist curled above the sea, glowing as the sun rose, and the breeze carried the faint smell of pine salt and something warm, fresh bread from the new cafe standing where Luke Harrison's cabin used to be. A year had passed since the fire, yet sometimes Luke still felt the phantom heat on his skin, the trembling weight of loss brushing against the quieter parts of his mind. But as he stood outside the newly built Ridgehaven Rescue Cafe, watching the early visitors gather, he felt something else, too stillness, not hollow, but full. The cafe itself was a modest wooden structure with wide windows that faced the ocean. Sunlight spilled through them, illuminating the sign handcrafted by Hank Miller Ridgehaven Rescue Cafe, carved with steady, deliberate strokes. Luke ran a hand along the wooden railing, his fingers tracing the smooth grain. His tall, lean frame, still hardened but no longer gaunt, seemed more grounded now. His dark brown hair, still grown just long enough to brush his collar, caught the wind and revealed the silver at his temples. His once haunted gray eyes held a gentler depth, as if their storms had learned where to rest. Behind him came the thundering sound of paws. Rufus, now a strong and athletic German shepherd of 1 year, bounded across the yard with a joyful bark. His black and tan coat gleamed in the morning light, and his steps carried the confidence of a dog who had survived a cruel beginning only to discover a world built for belonging. Luna followed closely, her smaller frame, graceful and alert ears twitching at every sound. Her soft tan fur, once dull with fear, now shimmered with health. Her dark eyes, always searching for Luke, found him with an affection so deep it seemed woven into her heartbeat. Maxwell, older, slower, noble, walked behind them like a patient mentor overseeing unruly young students. His once powerful gait had softened with age, but his amber eyes still held the wisdom of a dog who had lived many lives beside his master. He gave a low, approving huff as Rufus and Luna circled Luke's legs. Luke knelt, running his calloused hands through their fur, and murmured, "Easy there, you two. Training's in 5 minutes." Inside the cafe, Evelyn Hart was already bustling. At 58, her strong, rounded frame carried a graceful determination. Her warm hazel eyes shone behind flour-dusted glasses, and her silver-streaked hair was tied in a neat bun beneath a soft green scarf. She moved between tables with a lightness that came only from finding purpose again, carrying trays of steaming pastries and mugs of ginger tea that filled the room with a comforting aroma. "Luke," she called through the open door. "Don't let those pups run wild before breakfast. They nearly knocked over Mrs. Fletcher yesterday." "She forgave them," Luke replied, stepping inside as the dogs followed with eager tails. She gave Rufus half her biscuit. "That's exactly what I mean." Evelyn sighed, but her smile betrayed amusement. Her heart, once lonely behind the counter of her old bakery, now beat in rhythm with the lively chaos of the rescue center. Near the back of the cafe, Dr. Lydia Moore inspected a small Labrador pup lying on a soft blanket. Lydia, now 45, still carried her calm, earthy beauty with quiet confidence. Her auburn hair tied loosely in a braid framed a face softened by compassion and strengthened by the grief she had once endured. Her hazel eyes lifted when she noticed Luke and the dogs. "They're early," she said with a gentle smile. "Rufus looks like he's ready to train an army." "And Luna?" She paused as the small pup pressed closer to Luke's leg, still attached to her hero, I see. Luke chuckled softly. "She's earned the right." Lydia stroked the Labrador's paw. "We've had 4 adoption applications this week. The center's growing faster than we expected." "Because of you," Luke said. She shook her head. "Because of all of us. And because this town needed something to believe in again." Her words settled into the quiet corners of Luke's mind, like a truth he had always known, but never spoken aloud. A hammer clinked against wood. Hank Miller stood outside fixing the fence that lined the training yard. At 52, Hank looked older than his years, but no longer hollowed out by guilt. His once unruly gray and brown beard was trimmed now, and his broad shoulders moved with a steady rhythm rather than the swaying imbalance of drunkenness. The lines on his weathered face were still deep, but they were no longer carved by rage. They held responsibility, a quiet penitence, and the slow knitting together of a man learning to forgive himself. Hank Luke called out. "Fence holding up stronger than me," Hank replied, wiping sweat and sawdust from his brow. His voice held the roughness of gravel, but with a warmth that didn't exist a year ago. "Kids are coming for the morning tour. Can't have them escaping through a loose board." Rufus barked in agreement. Luna trotted over and nudged Hank's hand. He scratched her ears gently. "Hey there, little moonbeam," he murmured. "You're looking better every day." Luke watched the interaction quietly. There was something humbling about it, this man who once nearly ended their lives now pouring every ounce of himself into saving others. Redemption, Luke thought, was never loud. It was built in small repairs, soft apologies, and the courage to stay. The cafe soon filled with the sounds of morning children laughing as they tossed balls for the dogs, the clatter of mugs, Evelyn's soft singing as she kneaded dough, and Lydia's reassuring voice instructing a family on caring for their newly adopted pup. Luke stepped outside, letting the sea breeze brush against his face. The horizon stretched wide, shimmering beneath the sun's ascent. He stood there a long moment, breathing in the salt air, feeling the ache in his chest loosen in a way it hadn't for years. His dark hair lifted in the wind, revealing more silver at the temples. His gray eyes, once shadows, now held a quiet radiance. Behind him, Luna pressed her head against his leg. He rested a hand on her back and whispered, "Some miracles don't come with thunder. Sometimes they arrive because one small life decides to keep fighting." Inside the cafe, a polished wooden plaque hung on the wall. Simple words carved with steady hands, because someone cared. Luke looked at it as he stepped back inside, and something warm spread across his chest. Ridgehaven had healed not through grand gestures, but through hearts choosing to stay open even when broken, and somewhere deep within his once battle-scarred spirit, a quiet dawn finally arrived. In the quiet ashes of Ridgehaven, we are reminded that miracles rarely arrive with thunder. They bloom in the smallest acts of courage, in the kindness we choose each day, and in the gentle ways God guides broken hearts back to the light. If this story touched something in you, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of grace and redemption. May God bless you, protect you, and shine His peace upon everyone listening.